on expanding the Housing Choice Voucher program. This webinar is going to be a discussion among a panel of experts. My name is Jill Khadduri, and I will be moderating the panel discussion. But first, a few tips on using this WebEx technology. You may be seeing the panelists as a strip of small videos at the top of your screen. If you'd like to see us in bigger images, use the layout button at the top right hand of your screen and switch to side-by-side view, and then use the little double arrows to switch to between having a big slide and small people to having bigger people and a smaller slide. Another thing that you might want to do is to hide all the participants that have their video off. Those are people who are working behind the scenes, and that'll give you a better view just of the panelists. Now, this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to tell friends about it and have people look at it at a later time, especially people who may have registered but were not able to join us at this point. Everyone is muted except for the panelists, but please use the chat feature in a couple of different ways. Use it to tell us if you're having any technical problems, and also use it to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. So here are the three topics that I'm going to ask our panel to discuss. First, why should we expand the housing voucher program? What are the most important reasons for expanding it? Second, the feasibility of expanding it. How fast could the program be expanded? And finally, what are some changes to the program that might be implemented at the same time that the voucher program was substantially expanded? And again, add questions in the chat box at any time on any of these topics, and I will use them to help guide the panel discussion. So first of all, what is the Housing Choice Voucher program? Well, it's a time-tested program. It's been around since the 1970s. It's had essentially the same design for that entire period. It's a flexible way of providing affordable housing to the poorest renters. We have substantial evidence that it prevents and ends homelessness. And it also helps overcome racial inequities in housing. Despite discrimination, people of color, households of color, are able to use the program, the voucher program, at the same or higher rates as white households. Now, the voucher program, so why are we discussing vouchers today? Why is it particularly a salient topic? Well, the numbers are inadequate. The program grew steadily from the late 1970s until 2000 and then stalled. With only a couple of 100,000 vouchers over the 20-year period between 2000 and now. The numbers are inadequate. We need at least twice as many vouchers as the 2.2 million that we have now to meet the need for impoverished renters for housing assistance. And the Biden administration is considering how to expand the voucher program, which is very exciting. So we have a panelist to discuss this, a very expert panel. Before she became head of NARO, Adrienne Todman was the head of the Washington, D.C. Housing Authority. Andrew Lofton and Richard Monacchio are industry leaders within the Public Housing Authority leader. Doug Rice has written extensively on the voucher program at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And my apt colleague, Meryl Finkel, has led several studies on important aspects of the voucher program. So our first topic is, why should the federal government expand the voucher program? I've already given you some reasons, and then we're going to have a panel discussion about that. But before that, let's hear from you. You can, while the panel discussion is going on, click on the chat. In the chat box, you'll find a link. If you click on that link, that'll take you to a poll. and you can enter up to 3 words, giving us what you think is the most important reason for expanding the program. And then please remember to return to the webinar by clicking on that white and blue WebEx button, and that'll take you back out of the external website and back into the webinar. So we'll show your answers after the panel discussion, but let's turn to the panel now. So while both President Biden and Vice President Harris talked about a universal voucher program during their campaigns, meaning a program that would be available to everybody below a certain income limit, getting from 2 million vouchers to a universal program wouldn't be able to happen in a year or even 2 years, maybe not even 3 years. So how fast could the program scale up? I'd like to start by asking Adrienne Todman, how willing do you think your members are to receive substantial increments of vouchers?
Thank you, Jill, and thank you for the invitation to be here with my esteemed colleagues today. So I think what NARA members want is the ability to have resources that meet their local needs. And so we certainly want to be careful about having a voucher program that is doing just that at the local level, and also that the vouchers can be used and leased up in a way that makes sense, that we're not going into an area where there aren't enough private sector units in the inventory to lease up a more robust program. So that means we have to bring other types of solutions to the table. But certainly I think that members, and indicated by their waiting list. I mean, I'm sure our colleagues here from Seattle and Cook County will speak to their scenario, but I know that our members are willing and able to accept vouchers, provided that it's meeting a local need, and also that there are the resources available to administer the program. For over the past decades, the administrative fee, which is a critical part
Adrienne,
yes.
Okay, Adrienne, we're going to be returning to that topic later in the discussion. I'd like first of all to turn to Doug Rice and ask him that from his perspective, what are the most important reasons for expanding the program?
Well, I think you've put some of the main reasons up on the screen there. I mean, I think of housing as having kind of 4 key dimensions that affect people's well-being. It's the affordability aspect, which affects the financial resources and financial security that people have. It affects stability. The location of housing is also critical. There's a lot of evidence now that neighborhoods have a strong impact on people's well-being and children's long-term outcomes, and the housing quality itself also has an impact. And there's evidence that housing vouchers improve outcomes along all 4 of these dimensions. So as you've highlighted up here, housing voucher receipt significantly reduces poverty among people who receive them. And in fact, we've done some data analysis that shows that by making housing vouchers available to all eligible families, this would reduce the poverty gap between white and black households by up to 1/3 and by up to 1/2 between white and Latino households. So those are significant reductions in poverty. Also reduces incidence of food insecurity in households. There's some evidence that affordable housing of any kind, including vouchers, increases parents' investment in child enrichment activities, which can improve their math and reading skills over the long term. And then there's the stability. There's a lot of rigorous research, the Family Option Study, for instance, that shows that vouchers significantly reduce the incidence of instability and homelessness. And then on the neighborhood side of things, there is some evidence that housing vouchers, as they currently exist, do expand housing opportunities for for low-income households, especially Black and other households of color. And thanks to the work of Ross, Chetty, and others, there's evidence that when families use vouchers to locate in low-poverty neighborhoods with access to quality schools and other opportunities, this has positive health incomes on adults. It significantly improves the children's outcomes over the long term, increasing rates at which they attend college, reducing rates of single parenthood, increasing incomes as young adults. And then finally, worth mentioning is that for all of these reasons, expanding vouchers would also be a significant step towards advancing racial equity. As I'm sure everyone on the call realizes, people of color are much more likely to have unaffordable housing, to experience homelessness, and expanding rental assistance would reduce this disparities, as well as I said, reducing disparities in poverty, homelessness, and other kinds of hardship. And then also worth mentioning is the effects of segregation. So there's a history of federal, state, and local housing policies that have really pushed people of color, especially Black families, into neighborhoods that are under-resourced and over decades have tended to have weaker school districts for a variety of reasons, isolated people from all sorts of opportunities. And housing vouchers can play a role in reducing segregation by expanding housing opportunities and allowing people who wish to do so to take advantage of opportunities that exist in other neighborhoods.
Thank you so much, Doug. I mean, you've done a terrific job of surveying what we know from research and empirical evidence about the voucher program. Meryl, Finkel, do you have anything that you'd like to add to or expand on that?
Sure. I think I'll mention two pieces of research that we've done recently that support the things that Doug mentioned. First, our research supports the fact that vouchers really do help reduce homelessness. The study that ACT did on the impacts of providing various forms of assistance to families in homeless shelters found that providing vouchers greatly improved housing stability, as Doug mentioned, and improved adult and child outcomes at costs that are really no greater than keeping people in shelters. The second piece of research I wanted to talk about is work on the role that vouchers can play in increasing choice. As Doug mentioned, vouchers can enable people to look for housing in a wider range of locations, and that can help improve access to opportunity neighborhoods, which again can have long-term impacts on families and on their children.
So let me turn to our other panelists, Andrew Lofton, Rich Minacchio. Do you have anything that you'd like to add to that on the reasons for expanding the voucher program?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jill, and thanks, folks, for participating. I think a few key points were hit here. Certainly, in America, it's unconscionable that 3 out of 4 people who need housing assistance don't get it. Those households and families are doubled and tripled up. They have to forego basic necessities like food and medicine in order to pay the rent. So just on the basic human scale, the human level, it's just not right. I mean, this has to be done, and we're thankful for President Biden's commitment. I think the other things that, tagging on to what my colleague said, it certainly is a platform. Here we use housing as a platform, for example, to get moms to sign their kids up for Head Start, right? Try to change this generational aspect of poverty, trying to get kids into summer programs, getting kids into college. So when you're housed sufficiently and don't have to worry about being thrown on the street or living in a homeless shelter, you're much more likely to work to achieve goals. And this is a way we can really build hope for the next generation. And the last thing I would say is to the points we talked about. Yes, it is a way to desegregate without question, but it's a heavy lift. The advent of the small area fair market rents by HUD was one of the best things I think that has happened in a long time, because it makes it possible to use your voucher to go into a new neighborhood. But we also have to educate landlords and the public, because there's still a lot of discrimination out there.
Thank you, Richard. I see a question from one of our participants, which I think that Andrew Lofton may be particularly able to respond to. And this question is that continuums of care, and I think we have a lot of people in the audience who are coming from the homeless services side, continuums of care struggle to navigate people experiencing homelessness into vouchers, even when homeless preferences exist. I think there are both process and culture barriers. If universal vouchers are enacted, how do we ensure that people experiencing homelessness are prioritized? Andrew, from your perspective as executive director of the Seattle Housing Authority, an area that has a great deal of homelessness, do you have something to say about the ability of housing authorities to serve people experiencing homelessness?
Thank you, Jill. And again, thank you for the invitation to join the panelists here. And thank you for the question. I think that's a really, really good and insightful question about the use of vouchers and how it can help homelessness. I think the fundamental answer to that is that the voucher in and of itself isn't going to be the solution. There has to be additional support recognized that's going to be needed for those individuals. In the homeless system, the ability for someone to go from being non-housed to housed is a great first step. And as Richard indicated, housing in and of itself is a platform. It's not the solution to all ills, but it is a platform that must be in place. And once it's in place, with additional support and services, then the ability for that to serve the homeless population improves considerably. So added to the notion of expanding the number of vouchers that are available and in use, I think that has to be coupled with a recognition that the population that is going to be now served will also need some additional services, will need some additional support. And that has to be a part of the consideration if it's going to be successful.
Andrew, that's a really interesting or an important point. The family options study, which Doug alluded to and which my colleague Meryl talked a little bit more about, found that services appear to be sufficiently available in the system that if you gave people housing assistance that was not explicitly linked to services, but you just got them into permanent housing with a long-term subsidy, that they would not return to homelessness. They would not necessarily, that would not solve all their problems, and obviously people have substantial needs for services. But I guess my question is, how explicitly do services need to be linked to housing in order to address homelessness, or and to what extent is it the role of the housing subsidy system to provide those services?
Two different questions, Jill, but certainly I think that the availability of services is really the key, and the source of where that comes from is arguable, but the fact of the matter is that there will need to be some supports for those residents. And I think I would harken back to Adrian's earlier comment in her opening remarks about the ability for folks at the local level to drive and utilize what they're going to need to address their particular situation, because it'll be different in each community. What type of services are going to be needed, who delivers those services, what are the supports that are going to be most effective. I think we can all learn from each other in regards to many of those, but each local community is going to have to tailor what is going to be best suited for their particular environment.
I see a question. Would someone please comment on the merits of vouchers compared to an increase in public housing? Doug Bryce, would you be willing to take that one?
Sure. Well, I think it's certainly clear that both housing vouchers and public housing currently play a critical role in providing affordable housing to low-income households around the country. And so both certainly have a role now, and it's important. Looking to the future, I think we just need to be strategic about our investments. And we certainly, broadly speaking, need significant expansions of housing vouchers, but we also need capital investments to develop certain types of housing. But again, I think we need to be strategic in the latter. And you know, in many families who receive a voucher can lease in place in rental markets with moderate or high vacancy rates. There are units available for people to use a voucher if they want to move. It's not clear to me that in markets like that, a lot of additional capital investment is really required, at least in the short term. However, it is also clear that in other markets, capital investments are essential. And I have in mind markets that are really tight, where there's an undersupply of housing broadly, really low vacancy rates. Simply expanding vouchers alone is not going to be enough. In addition, so there are supply issues in some markets, especially in coastal areas. But in addition, there are certain types of housing where capital investments, I think, can be really useful. Expanding supportive housing for people with disabilities who need ready access to certain kinds of services in order to remain stably housed over the long term. That housing configured in that way is not necessarily available in a market, and so investments can be important in that case too.
Would anybody else like to comment on that topic before we move on and go to the next part of the panel discussion?
Yeah, just real quick.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment. I'm happy to comment on that. I think one of the things with the voucher program that we all realize is that it depends on private sector landlords as business partners, and there are some families who are seeking housing where they might not be able to pass a credit check, there might be a background check, any of the screening protocols that the private sector has. So the expansion of public housing in some form, not necessarily the form that we've had in the past several decades, could be critical to making sure that some of those families that are hardest to house do have some place to live where the voucher is not a good tool for them.
Well, let's go on. Let's go on to see what our participants, what our audience said about what they thought were the most important reasons for expanding the voucher program. I'm not seeing anything so far. Here we go. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of interesting things here. I see, a lot about homelessness. I see homelessness all over the place here, alleviating poverty, too few vouchers, housing should be a right, huge unmet need, alleviating poverty. Yep. Well, thank you very much for giving us your perspective. I mean, you've got so many answers here that I really am having trouble seeing all of them. I mean, increasing my screen here. Housing stability, community need, helps the most vulnerable, desegregation, racial justice, all very terrific reasons. Thank you so much. So let's go back to the panel now. Okay, so on to the next topic, which I kind of jumped the gun and got into that topic earlier. How fast can the voucher program scale up? Adrian Todman, you talked about why PHAs would be willing to scale up the program, what they think are their unmet needs for the program. Does the other housing authorities, Rich Minacchio, Andrew Lofton, do you want to talk about how willing you and your PHA executive director colleagues and their boards would be to take on substantial increments of vouchers in the next year, in the next 2 years, in the next 3 years?
Sure. Thank you. And I agree with Adrian. We're very willing, obviously. The unmet need is huge. A couple of things, though. We've learned a little from operating, well, a couple of things recently. We're operating a rental assistance program from the CARES Act, so we've had to staff up quickly. And it's important, first of all, that the fees be sufficient, obviously, so that we can get qualified people to run the program and train them properly. But, on the question of need, we just opened up our waiting list for the first time in 20 years here. And on the first day, we got 28,000 applications. So I think, anybody in this business, certainly like we are, certainly wants to see more resources into the system. But it also has to be balanced against sufficient fees, because right now, and I know this is the case with my colleagues too, Andrew and others, we have caseloads of like 500 people. Like one housing specialist has a caseload of 500. That isn't ideal. That's not ideal, because you want to do more for the person than just get the rent check out. So while we would definitely welcome significantly more vouchers, the administrative fees have to be sufficient.
So the administrative fees have to be sufficient to support enough staff, but how fast could you staff up? I mean, how fast could you hire enough additional people, train enough additional people, get the additional frontline workers in place to use a substantial increment of vouchers?
Within months. We've proven that we've done it here with the county's rental assistance program. So I would say that, with a full force in place, you could do it within months.
And Adrian, what's your perspective on that from the standpoint of your membership, which includes a very large number of all the housing authorities in the U.S.?
Right. I would say, coupled with the resources, if we want to have a universal voucher program that works well, we really need to take a look at streamlining the rules so that the program can work seamlessly inside of a real estate environment. So with a streamlined program, I think that we'll see the need to really staff up to keep up with some of those rules is not necessary, because you'll be able to streamline the way we look at inspections, we'll streamline the way that we look at determining rent, streamline the way that we're working with landlords, again, who we will need at the table. So I think that, and particularly as we see some of the advocacy around right now streamlining the emergency rental assistance program that was approved by Congress, people want it streamlined because they want to have those funds used quickly. I don't think we should look at the voucher program any differently. So in a current environment, I think that folks at housing authorities of every side can move these dollars along to the extent there are units available that can absorb, and there are families that are sending in their documents. But I think if we have a streamlined program that meets the 21st century voucher program, I think we'll find that the staff needs, while necessary, will not necessarily hold the program back.
So you mentioned a couple of particular examples of streamlining: simplifying the housing quality inspection process, simplifying the process for determining rents. Meryl, Finkel, you led a big study at the administration of the voucher program a few years ago. Do you have anything to add to that? What does that research tell us?
Well, so I guess I wanted to highlight two things. One is when we did the study on administrative costs in the voucher program, I mean, it's clear that to successfully increase the number of vouchers quickly, we need to make sure that they can cover, the PHAs can cover their administrative costs. And so the regime of proration really restricts what they can do. And so clearly that I think we need to make sure that administrative costs can be covered by fees in order for PHAs to expand. And the other area where I think changes need to happen is improving landlords' acceptance of the voucher program. And I think that has to come from both a pull and a push. So from the push, sort of it's, making, as Adrian was just saying, making the program easier to work with, making, whether it's incentive payments to landlords or damage claim payments and other things like that. But there also needs to be, on the other end, maybe increasing the applicability of source of income discrimination rules so they're applicable, in more places. And so landlords can still find ways to not accept vouchers, but, the more pressure we have to make sure that vouchers are more acceptable in more places, I think the better for the possibility of program expansion.
Doug Rice, let me turn to you. Do you have any views on simplification? What are the areas in which you think the administration of the voucher program could be simplified without undercutting the basic purposes of the program to get people into high quality housing at rents that are the right rents?
Yeah, so I agree with things that others have said. When you look at the admin fee study that HUD did, significant shares of staff time were devoted to doing inspections, or recertifying families every year, and doing certain tasks like that can be reduced in their frequency and over time. And in fact, there have been some changes in policy in recent years that, for instance, reducing the frequency of inspections or the frequency of income recertifications for seniors or people with disabilities who are living on fixed incomes. And those are all positive steps, and we ought to be looking at other steps like that too. So, Richard Minacchio, your housing authority, Cook County, does not have what's called moving to work flexibility. You're not able to vary the design of the program beyond what's currently possible in law and regulation. What would you like to see most changed about the program to make it simpler to administer and easier to expand?
Yes, thank you for that question. Not having moving to work status has hindered us somewhat. We've been able to do a lot of innovative things, but I think the one thing that we would do that some of our colleagues can do, we still have to touch a file every year and recertify somebody who's on Social Security. And that just doesn't make any sense. Doug mentioned it, and so I would rather have that time used, in a couple different ways to handle more applications, or also guide folks to social services. So, having to recertify folks on fixed incomes every year, like housing authorities that are not in moving to work status have to do, that should be changed.
So, I'd like to turn, as we know, this is a program that has very decentralized, I don't know whether that's the right term, administration. There are 2,000 housing authorities administering the voucher program. Some of them are quite large, some of them are quite small. Some states administer the program outside of areas that have their own housing authorities. There are a few states that administer the program statewide, Michigan, Massachusetts, New Jersey. Although there are also local housing authorities in those states. Doug Rice, would you like to comment on whether you would like to see additional states administer the program?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting, an important question. I mean, states are, there are certainly, at least in theory, advantages to states administering vouchers. One of these is that I think it facilitates partnerships between the state administrator of housing vouchers and other state agencies that have resources dedicated to supporting low-income families. And I have in mind agencies like state Medicaid agencies or child welfare agencies. For instance, a lot of states are looking at ways to help people with disabilities who are currently in living in very expensive institutional settings, how to help them move out into the community where their quality of life can be better and their outcomes better. But that requires, to do that successfully, requires a mix of housing support as well as other kinds of support. And if a state has both of those types of resources at hand, it can coordinate in a way that makes it easier in some ways to use those resources to help people. Also, as you mentioned, and so about 2/3 of states have a state agency that administers a voucher program, but as you noted, really just a small number of these have jurisdiction over the entire state. I do think having jurisdiction over an entire state is an advantage as well. The fact that we have 2,200 housing authorities with their own somewhat overlapping jurisdictions, and some metro areas are literally dozens of housing authorities with jurisdictions, and it creates a balkanized system that can make it more challenging for families in need to access the program, or if they receive a voucher, to move across the metro area, across jurisdictions. And so, having a state agency with a statewide jurisdiction streamlines that kind of access for families in some ways, and it may streamline it for landlords too.
Would anybody else like to comment on that? If not, I don't see anybody's square lighting up. Yep. Okay, Adrian.
Yeah, I think, there's something to be said by having more folks being able to provide families with options of how they access the benefit. But I would disagree with the concept that somehow a state-level program would act much more seamlessly than a local program. And we mentioned before that very critical to a voucher program, a tenant-based voucher program, is a business partnership with landlords. Landlords don't tend to have relationships at the state level. They have relationships at the local level. And so if we want to make sure that we're creating a process that is very inclusive of having landlords come to the table and understand the program, I think that local entities that probably already know those landlords may go to their church. I mean, be a little facetious there, but those are business-to-business relationships that tend to happen better at the local, perhaps regional, and but not necessarily better at the statewide. So, I mean,
I hear your point about housing is local, landlords exist at the local level, but the state agencies that administer the voucher program, I'm thinking of New Jersey in particular, because that state agency was part of the administrative fee study that we've talked about. New Jersey has county offices that administer the program. It's statewide in the sense that the state agency conducts some of the functions, maintains waiting lists and so forth, but the county-based housing authorities are those that actually have relationships with landlords, inspect the units, determine the rents, help people find housing and so forth. But
wouldn't those county agencies just be a local public housing authority in a different form?
No, they're not local. Well, they do the same thing that local public housing authorities do, but they do it, sort of under the umbrella of the state. I saw a very interesting question here that has to do with feasibility of expansion. This person is saying more resources sometimes leads to more corruption. But what will be the way that the federal government holds PHAs accountable for insider dealings and giving vouchers to friends and family? Do any of the Housing Authority executive directors want to comment on that question?
And I'll certainly comment, and then would be interested what Andrew has to say. I think people in this business, are in it for a reason, and the vast majority of people who manage these programs do it the right way. And just to say that, well, we better be careful about adding more vouchers to the program because it's going to lead to more corruption, really, I don't think is the right way to look at this, because obviously the need is there, and not to play class warfare here, but when we've had significant cuts in tax cuts for the wealthy, but much fewer IRS folks to manage that program, I don't hear a lot of complaining about that corruption and the money that's lost. So I would say, no, the benefit of adding vouchers to this program and taking care of millions of more families far outweigh the incidences that could happen of more corruption, because there are a lot of checks in place.
I would agree with what Richard just described. I think the issue around corruption, because the program would be expanded, is sort of a false flag. I think that, as Richard indicated, the vast majority of folks who do this work in the public housing industry, work in the affordable housing industry, they are focused on the work. They're doing it for the right reasons, and they're professional. And there's no reason to believe that that's not going to continue simply with an expansion of the program. I think the programs are run well, and if there are folks who are wanting to break the law, then we need to hold them accountable and make sure that we weed that out. But I don't think that a concern for mass corruption because we expand the program, I think that's really overstated.
Well, thanks to both of you. I want to return for a moment to the possibility of more state administration of the program, because I see a question here. What about a coordinated entry type program where different PHAs can pull clients from a single centralized list per state? Doug, I think you found that an interesting question and wanted to say something about it.
Well, yeah, I think that's another, we've focused on state agencies, but, there's lots of ways that the program administration could be streamlined. And one way is by consolidating certain kinds of functions and certainly creating a single, one-stop application and waiting lists for large areas or statewide even. I think, makes things a lot easier for families and a lot fairer in some ways. And it can also reduce the overall administrative burden for housing authorities. If you're just administering one list rather than, say, 50 separate waiting lists by 50 separate housing authorities in a particular metro area, that reduces the administrative burden too. So one additional question that I wanted to get to here, because we are planning to cover it under the next topic, time limits. Why wouldn't it make as much sense to expand access to vouchers by time limiting eligibility to, say, 5 years for any household that's not disabled and not headed by an elderly person? Does anybody want to talk about 5-year time limits and whether, you know, how much would that actually change the way the program currently works?
I can start because so as you mentioned earlier, Jill, the MTW agencies can do certain things and we're not. So time limits are not something we do. Now, I think we have to be careful with time limits. I mean, we have to look at what happened with, with welfare reform too, when that was time limited. Now, it certainly makes sense that we want everybody to become self-sufficient without question. But, we do serve a lot of households with single parents, with children, and we at the local level, the housing authority directors and the staff are not going to put those families on the street. It's just not the right thing to do. But at the same time, I think we can have programs, pilot programs that test the time limits, and most importantly, really have programs that encourage self-sufficiency. I mean, not everybody's going to take advantage of it, but a lot of people are. So that would be my main concern, that we do not want to be in the business of putting families on the street.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I would second that. We don't want to be in the position of putting families out on the street. But I think that the issue of time limits is really goes back to it's a really local community decision, local community choice around what is important and what it works for that community. And so I would be really concerned if there was a mass rule for the entire program because it may not work in certain markets and certain communities.
So you're saying that you're saying that a time limit might be very well in a place where a poor family could gain enough income to be able to afford housing on their own pretty quickly, whereas in a very high-cost housing market like Seattle, even a 5-year time limit might not make any sense. Is that?
I think that's a good example. But I also think that there have been some housing authorities who have moved into work and have used time limits and have been very successful and very effective in those communities. There are other housing authorities who have not gone that direction because for their community that does not bode well, and it's not a really effective solution. So I think the issue of time limits is really not about time limits in and of themselves, but what does that local community think is going to work for their use of and utilization of those vouchers in their community.
I see it.
Like time limits.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, the question. I just want to point out, time limits would, if they were considered, would only be considered for non-elderly, non-disabled family, I assume, right? Is that, I assume that everybody agrees it would be off the table for the elderly and disabled households?
Yeah, I assume that too.
Okay, because there were some questions about that in the chat.
Yeah, I also see a good point made by somebody in the chat box, which is that for families with children or for households that don't have a disabled adult or are not headed by an elderly person, typically such families do not stay in the program for as long as 5 years. They leave the program sooner. So it may make a very big difference whether we're talking about a 5-year time limit, a 3-year time limit, a 2-year time limit. I think we have a fair amount of experience with a time-limited program, that is to say the rapid rehousing program that is implemented across the country by the Homeless Services System, that 6 months of assistance is probably not enough. A year of assistance may not be enough. So it seems to me we really don't know enough at this point about, how long a time limit would have to be set in order to really change the program, number one, and in order to have enough time to achieve housing stability on the other.
Can I comment on this too?
Yes, please, Doug. From a policy perspective, I think the idea of time limits really undercuts the basic goals of the program here, right? So, the goal of the program is to promote stability among households, affordability, freeing up resources for them to spend money on other things they need, like food and medicines and child enrichment activities and so on. And time limits, which no matter how they're set are going to be arbitrary, really undercut those goals for families in a time-limited program. And then, as others have said, the average time spent in the program for families with kids is on the order of 4 or 5 years. It's not a very long period. Many of the folks who stay longer are seniors and people with disabilities from the data we've seen. And I think we do have some experience with this. In the TANF program, there are time limits, and there's evidence that, one effect of that is that the TANF program, which provides income support to families, has become a lot less effective over time at reducing poverty among families, and then it has all sorts of weird incentives. There's evidence that families actually forego receiving assistance, even if it creates, additional hardship for them, because they're worried about using up their lifetime time limit. And I think it's a bad policy overall. And especially in this current context where there are substantial resources being put on the table to expand the program, it's at the very least the wrong time to be talking about policy changes like that.
Right. And I would just add that I agree with what Andrea said, that it really becomes a localized issue. For those moving to work agencies that have applied a time limit to their program, I think they've been very thoughtful and careful about what that time limit was based upon the other housing, the availability of other affordable housing in their communities, and also have been very considerate about if somebody hit that time limit, whether or not they've actually achieved their family goals, which was set forth at the beginning. So I think that time limits are arbitrary, but for where it has been applied, at least I'm proud of the moving to workers who've been very thoughtful about that application.
We had a clarification question. Can you explain what moving to work is in just a couple of sentences, Adrienne?
Sure. Moving to work is a designation that was created by Congress back in the 1990s for housing authorities to look at using their public housing and Section 8 funding fungibly. That means that they would use it almost as a block grant type once they receive the funds from HUD, but even more so the ability to look at existing HUD regulations and make common sense decisions on whether or not those regulations should be re-regulated into something that works locally, such as a broader schedule of inspections and different ways to calculate income.
Right. And I'd just like to add to that moving to work has, in some sense, served as a testing ground for changes that can be made across the program. Things like less frequent inspections, less frequent income certification for people on fixed incomes, and so forth. So the moving to work demonstration has served that important purpose. Let's go on to the final topic, which we've already gotten into in some sense, which is what should be changed or what might be changed about the about the program to make it more effective. Meryl, you mentioned small area fair market rents, which you led a study on small area fair market rents recently. Can you explain what those are and why that is an important change?
Sure. So small area fair market rents enable PHAs to set their payment standard at the zip code level rather than the metro level, which means that in higher rent areas, the payment standard is higher than in low rent areas. And so what this does is it lets voucher holders find units in a wide range of neighborhoods, which then basically increases the available stock of units available to voucher holders overall, and it also increases access to areas of opportunity for voucher holders. It's particularly important for families with children to get access to better neighborhoods and better schools.
So, Richard, you were an early adopter of small area fair market rents in Cook County. Can you explain why you did that and what the result was?
So in our county, we administer about 17,000 vouchers. And if you look at the map, a huge proportion of voucher holders were situated in the south suburbs. And that goes against the whole idea of the program, right? It's housing choice, but if the payment standard will only pay for rents in certain communities, then by definition, rents in more affluent communities are off limits. So we adopted it early because we have some of the wealthiest suburbs in the country and some of the poorest suburbs in the country here. So now we have put together a pretty robust mobility program that tries to move and has been successful to some degree, moving families to areas of opportunity that have better schools, better transportation, et cetera. But the one other thing that's very important, and it's been said here, source of income protection must be a national priority because some cities have it and some don't. The city of Chicago has it and Cook County has it. So it's now illegal to say we do not accept Section 8. Now, it is true that if landlords will use other means like credit as a proxy to discriminate, for example, but it's very important that we have the law on our side. And in Cook County and Chicago and many other cities, we do with source of income protection, but a lot of areas do not. And in those areas, we hear stories about people having to apply 50 or 60 times for an apartment because they're discriminated against for their voucher. So this is, as I said earlier, one of the best programs I've seen at HUD, but it has to come with some local authority to reduce and really make illegal discrimination.
So, Richard, would you like to see the Biden administration attempt to enact a national source of income law?
Yes.
And how effective do you think that would be? Isn't it the case that even in places that have source of income laws, landlords nonetheless turn voucher households trying to use vouchers away?
Yes, it is true. But I think in certain things, and housing is one of them, we don't get as far as we need to get without federal leadership. Okay, we saw that with voting rights, of course, and I think we need to see that again with voting rights. But this is an issue that has to come from the federal level because it's a national priority. This country has got a history of unfortunately discrimination, racial discrimination that we then have to fight. And in this case, we're fighting it sort of, 50 or 100 or 200 ways. And I think that, this administration has made equity a high priority, and to have that kind of national standard, I think, is a very sensible move.
So, Andrew Lofton, would you like to comment on that as well?
Absolutely. I think I agree 100% with what Richard has described, both in terms of being able to target small area markets, rent, payment standards, and well as backing things up with a source of income enforcement. The ability for families to, as the program is proposing, to live wherever they would like, is really predicated on the affordability question. And there are huge swaths of geography where the payment standards cannot compete. And so those areas are by definition off limits. So being able to adjust and address those types of inequities throughout your community will be extremely important in order to make sure that folks have true access and true choice of where they would like to live. But it does be backed up with enforcement of source of income. And we've had source of income in Seattle for decades. There is still ways in which landlords can discriminate, but it does give us a foundation to pursue and to help assist potential tenants.
So what can the federal government do to help, not simply by either encouraging states and localities to have source of income laws or enacting a national law? What can the federal government do to support the enforcement of source of income laws?
Well, I think it, first of all, it has to be in place. There's a checkerboard of jurisdictions that have source of income and some that do not, and that will bring some consistency to that. And as Richard indicated, that can only be done kind of at the federal level, that this is something that we fundamentally are committed to. And then once that is in place, I think the accountability for that has to have some teeth to it. There has to be some accountability if there is discrimination found for folks who are willing to go about violating that approach. So,
Andrew, I don't remember whether Seattle, King County has small area fair market rents. Just to go back to the explanation of that, there are a number of metropolitan areas in which HUD has required housing authorities to use small area fair market rents, but in many others they're voluntary. Should small area fair market rents be mandatory across the entire country?
I don't know if that should be mandatory. That should be people should be having the option of being able to use them. We do not have small area rents in fair market rents in Seattle, King County. Both Seattle, King County housing authorities are MTW, and so we have our ability to modify our sort of market area rent standards ourselves, and so we've done that locally with our own authority with a approach that we think works for us, and it's different, slightly different than the federal approach, but it does target areas that we believe need to have some increased buying power for our residents.
I just saw a question come into the chat box that I think Meryl can address.
Yeah.
Which is there a trade-off? Is there a trade-off between having higher fair market rents or higher payment standards as a result of small area fair market rents and serving more people by spreading the housing assistance payment dollars further?
So one thing I will comment on, you had asked Jill before I answer that question about whether smaller cars should be national. And one thing, and I think it was also one of the comments, is that zip codes might not be the best way to allocate fair market rents. You know, right now, that's what the small area fair market rent rule does. It could be that for certain jurisdictions, having rent set at the census tract level or some other level makes more sense. I mean, I think this was an easy way to implement it, but I don't think that's written in stone. And I think, if a PHA does have flexibility, that it might make sense to do it in a more refined way. And so, in terms of the other question about utilizing more fair market rents versus assisting more people, one of the things about the small area fair market rent rule is that over time, and there is a hold harmless time period, but over time, actually, the rents, the half payments in the low rent areas actually goes down. So one could imagine that if the payments are going up in parts of the jurisdiction and down in another part of the jurisdiction, the overall cost to the PHA would be the same. I mean, it could sort of depends on where people move and whether they move to these higher rent areas. And a PHA could adjust that as they see how their population is moving or staying. So it's kind of like an art in a way for a PHA to set the rents to make sure that they're serving either the same number of people or a choice of more or fewer people.
And I would just jump in. I think that any program design should seek to first do no harm. And if there are families who are impacted, and first let me say that I'm a big believer in localized rents. I think small area FMRs are a good tool, but an imperfect tool because the data is sometimes behind the market at the local level. So we can that's a different topic. But I do think that there are many families that live in areas where the allowable rent would go down. And these might be families who are seniors. These might be families who are disabled. These might be families who don't want to necessarily move and whose landlords will react, let's say, very strongly to a reduced rent from the program. And so I think it's unfair to put the burden on families who might be in that situation. It's unfair to put a burden on those families just for the sake of getting other families into better neighborhoods. We need to find a way to do both, and I think that there is a way to do both, but we need to acknowledge that in doing both, it means that program costs will go up.
But but isn't it the case, Meryl, that current users of vouchers are held harmless when small area fair market rents are implemented?
Yes, but it changes over time. At a certain recertification, it does go down. So they're definitely, as Adrienne is saying, people over time are affected, and they're and that could either cause them to move or to not be able to afford their unit, which is certainly not. I don't think that's something that people want, because somebody's been living in a unit for years, have good relationships with their landlords. All of a sudden, they can't. The payment standard goes down, and sometimes, at least in the demonstration, some landlords, had agreed to lower the rents, but that's not always feasible because landlords have to cover their costs as well.
I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat box about landlord incentives. I mean, we've been talking about the rent that the landlord can get, and obviously that's important. But what other kinds of landlord incentives have the Housing Authority Executive Directors, been able to implement? What do you think are the most important kinds of incentives for landlords, other than the kind of enforcement of source of income laws and on paying a high enough rent? What are some other ways that landlords can be incentivized to accept vouchers?
So, go ahead, Andrew.
Just very quickly, just a couple of things. One of the things that landlords hold really high priority for them is the speed in which we can respond and work with them. So one of the best incentives is a really quick response to addressing the contractual and regulatory issues that are necessary to get folks into the unit. Our taking 15 to 30 days to turn around a lease request, that it's not going to work. They need to have that done in 24, 48 hours, and if we can't do that, that's going to be a problem. So the best incentive is to be able to be responsive to the landlords. I think there's also some ability to just care and feed landlords, keeping them apprised of the program, keeping them informed about what we're doing, and just staying in touch with them. Building that relationship allows for lots of things to be expedited and for them to be much more receptive to the program. And then there are some very specific things that they are going to be focused on. The damage deposits, security deposits, ways in which they can be assured that those are going to be available. Working with clients who may not have the best credit at all, and having the housing authority be in a position to support that relationship. Those are the kinds of things that landlords are looking for, and from their perspective on a business arrangement, would be well received.
So I'd like to turn to the allocation formula. With very small increments of vouchers over recent years, and most of them for special sub-programs of the voucher program and allocated by competition, although not exclusively by competition. Now, if we had a much bigger program, if we had several 100,000 additional vouchers coming into the program, what would be the best way to allocate those vouchers? I know that Richard Monacchio suggested that we put that on our list of things that the program, reason why the program might want to be changed.
Yes. So, and I would just like to say I agree 100% with Andrew on the last point. It's very important. I mean, when I go out and talk to landlords, my pitch is my program's going to fit into your business model. So that's what we have to do. But on this point, the Chicago metropolitan area is a perfect case in point. And Brookings and others have written about this. We've seen, unfortunately, a suburbanization of poverty. And right now, for example, there are as many poor people living in Cook County outside of Chicago as there are living in the city. And the city in this case has about 3 times as many vouchers. Now, one thing I want to preface my remarks by saying, we can't go after each other and say, I want some of yours, give me. That's not the way to do this. But it has to be the formula has to recognize that we have seen changes in the incidences of poverty and where people live. Much more poverty in suburbs, inner ring and outer ring, small towns and rural areas. So I think by taking that into account when we grow the program, it does a couple things. It makes it more equitable because you're helping more people where they live with vouchers. And the second thing that's very important, it helps us build public support for the program, right? Because if poor people every place who need it have access to it, then it becomes something that people see as a true benefit for the entire country.
Bryce, do you have a perspective on how an allocation formula ought to work?
As you noted early on, it's been 20 years since we've allocated significant numbers of vouchers in over a year or several year period. And in recent years, they've all been highly targeted to veterans experiencing homelessness and so on. In a context in which we're contemplating a sizable expansion, I of course, I completely agree that the allocation has to be based on need, measured in some way. And there is the statutory formula, what people call the fair share formula, that is based on various need factors. It's been a while since I've looked at it, so it may need to be tweaked, but it certainly has to be. Vouchers ought to be allocated based on need going forward, at least in large numbers.
So here's another question, Richard, that you suggested that we might want to discuss. Currently, the income limit for the voucher program is 50% of area median income, with 75% of households newly admitted to the program having to have incomes below 30% of area median income. That varies by area, but it's roughly the poverty level. Is that the right? Are those the right income limits? Is that the right targeting of the program, or should we be thinking about different income limits in the context of an expanded program?
Yes, I think that's the right limit today. But when we talk about an expanded program, I think we have to liberalize the income limits, because we all know, everybody on this webinar knows, this is a huge appropriations list. I mean, we're talking about a huge increase in the voucher program if we get to the point where everybody who's income eligible is helped. And I think we've seen in this country, when programs are made available to a wider section of the population, you build public support. Now, I'm not saying that I'm still talking about low-income people here. Like, for example, going to the limits to 80%, like the Public Housing Authority program has, it seems to me makes sense, because you're including more people, and these people are also paying 60, 70% of their income for rent. So, yes, my point is, if we have an expansion of the program, even though right now it makes total sense to target the resources to the poorest of the poor, if we have an expansion of the program, I think it makes sense to make it available to a wider section of Americans.
Okay, so you might think about doing that in stages rather than all at once. I know certainly people who are advocates for people experiencing homelessness, if anything, would like to see lower income limits than those that we have currently. Doug Rice, do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I think you just made an interesting point about, and we had some discussion of this earlier. Any very large expansion of the voucher program is going to have to be phased in over a number of years as housing authorities staff up, as local markets in many areas are going to take time to adjust, and so one question is, well, so how do you phase in the expansion, and how would you want to target the initial allocations of vouchers? And I think a strong case can be made to, in the initial allocations, you want to target them, at least in part, to address particularly urgent problems like homelessness. With respect to the other question on the income limit, I think we just have to acknowledge trade-offs here, right? And I think Richard agrees with the existing targeting, and there's a reason for the existing targeting. When we look at the data on the distribution of households with severe cost burdens, well, there's 10 million households with very low incomes with severe cost burdens, but only 1 million households between the 50% and 80% of area median income. And so the vast majority of the severe need is among the lower income households there. And expanding eligibility increased costs as well, and an expansion costs are going to be a consideration. I think I get Richard's point about the potential political benefits, and we've heard some of this from some communities, but I actually think it's a mixed bag. You also hear a lot about the importance of targeting the resources we have to the people who need it most. And for instance, when you look back several years ago, the Bipartisan Policy Commission, when they put together their affordable housing plan, and this was a commission of Republican and Democratic former members of Congress, their plan included a voucher entitlement, but it was even more deeply targeted than the existing voucher program. It went only to households with extremely low incomes, and I think to some extent that reflected the political judgment of the members of that group.
I see a lot of great questions coming in, but we're getting towards the end, and I would, sort of continuing this discussion of the politics of expansion, let's go on and talk about what happens next. I'd like to hear if the panelists have anything to say about where the Biden administration is on expansion of the voucher program. What are the possibilities over the next year, over the next couple of years for actually seeing a substantial expansion of the program?
Well, I can jump in and start there too. Even before we talk about the Biden administration, I do think that in recent years there's really been growing awareness of the importance of affordable housing and the severity of the challenges that people are facing. We see this in really across the spectrum and in the areas of healthcare. People who are spending a lot of time and resources trying to solve problems in the health world, education world, civil rights. They increasingly realize that they really need to expand affordable housing. And so there's this growing support across the policy spectrum there. And I think the COVID has also highlighted the importance of stable housing as well. So there is this kind of groundswell of support for the idea. And then, of course, we have an incoming administration, which is certainly the first administration in history to come into office with an ambitious platform for housing, including proposing to expand programs to all eligible. So I think that adds to the momentum, and we're very hopeful that as the administration pulls out plans in coming months, that it will include proposals to significantly expand the voucher program. The final thing worth mentioning is that, of course,
I'm sorry.
In the majority of...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, with the majority in the House and the Senate, it looks like to move two separate bills under the so-called reconciliation rules, which allows bills to be approved. These two bills do represent real political opportunities to secure significant additional resources for affordable housing, expansion of the voucher program. And so there's real political opportunities this year too.
Adrian Todman, would you like to jump in here and get out your crystal ball?
Yeah, I would echo what Doug just said. I think that we have as good a political climate here in D.C. to see some major expansion in the program as we ever had in the past couple of decades. You have a willing administration that's in and understands the power of the program for all the reasons we just suggested, and we have a Congress that may be educated by the impact of the pandemic on housing security, understands the value of there being a housing safety net that's available to more and more families across the country. I mean, the annual cost for the voucher program is roughly $23 billion, and we saw a $25 billion emergency rental assistance program. So clearly, when there's a political will, we can get some major expansion. So I do think it will happen. Having said that, it's still a long road to go. There might be a demonstration expansion. There might be little categories of individuals that the Congress might want to see housed before others. I do think that it will take a lot of advocacy on everybody's part who's watching this right now. It shows you care about the program to really weigh in about what the needs are in your locality and let your elected leaders know.
Thank you. Anybody else want to speak to that issue before we wrap up?
I'd just like to say quickly, I think Doug and Adrian summed it up very well. And as I sit here from the other Washington, I guess I'd just like to suggest that the focus on the voucher expansion actually might be too narrow. The issue, I think, is affordable housing, affordability for low-income individuals, low-income families, low-income people. And vouchers are one way to do that, one solution to that issue. And I would caution us not to get solely focused on just that one solution and not address or think about other possible tools in the toolbox that could also contribute to that issue. Again, Adrian and Doug, I think, have described that. I think there's the fact that it's on the agenda of a new administration coming in is huge. And those conversations, I think, are going to be productive, and I think there will be some movement in that direction.
Well, I want to thank our truly wonderful panel for a great conversation. We've had a very large number of participants. We have a very, very big audience for this webinar. I think that just shows us how important this issue is and how much enthusiasm there is for talking about it. So again, Adrian Todman of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Andrew Lofton of the Seattle Housing Authority, Richard Minacchio of the Housing Authority of Cook County, Illinois, Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and my colleague Meryl Finkel from Apt Associates. And just to remind you once again that this webinar has been recorded, and so that if you know people from your organizations who signed up but were not able to join, let them know that we will be posting a link to the recording of the webinar, and we will also be making that. We'll be posting it in a way I think that other people can find it as well. I really want finally to thank the audience for their extremely thoughtful questions and comments. I saw a lot of good ideas, a lot of interesting questions going by. I tried to ask some of them of the panelists, but there's just so much that, that you, the audience, also had to contribute to this. So I want to thank you as well. And once again, thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience. Thank you, all of those who worked behind the scenes to help us put this webinar on. And Doug has just asked. Well, somebody asks us to post the slides. That would be good. And I think, Doug, you asked whether we have an ability to capture the chat and save it and post it. And I think because we are recording the webinar that we do save the chat questions, and I'm seeing an answer to that from one of our behind the scenes people. Yes, we have been able to save the chat. So again, thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.